Mark Twain once said, "Worrying is like paying a debt you don't owe." Is he right? Keep listening to find out. Welcome to the Money Meets Medicine podcast, where we talk all about the personal finance topics you wish you had learned in medical school. I'm your host, Justin Harvey, and here is your co-host, who recently spent $6,000 on medical treatment, Dr. Jimmy Turner.
Yeah, this is quickly turning into a show about my thyroid. But all that said, the reason I mention this is because this show is about financial anxiety and stress. And even though I live in the world of personal finance and I teach people about money and write books and podcast about money, like financial stress and anxiety is a thing. And even for those of us that live in this space. And so, yeah, I was a little surprised by the cost of the radiation treatment for my thyroid, which is where that $6,000 bill came from. But I guess if I think about it, they gave me a tracer to begin with. They took an uptake scan, whatever that was, 4 hours later. And then I had to get another uptake scan the next day before they gave me the final treatment. So it was like 4 different visits. And it ended up costing like $6,000. Now I have a health savings account. I didn't expect this to happen, right? So if I knew that I had like an upcoming $6,000 medical expense, I probably would have skipped the HSA for this year and just gone for like a normal regular plan that would have been a very defined cost for me. But because it's an HSA, I just like take it right in the teeth until I am not forced to anymore. And so we're not touching our HSA money. We're continuing to save that. The entire idea behind an HSA, right, is it's pre-tax money. It goes in pre-tax. It's saved pre-tax. And so it just continues to grow pre-tax. And as long as you spend it on medical treatment, it's pre-tax. And so it's the only triple free account. But for me, that kind of put some financial stress and anxiety into my life because I was like, I can't touch that money. I've decided that I'm going to cash roll. I'm going to bankroll anything that comes into my life from a healthcare stance. I didn't expect a $6,000 bill. And so had to step into my emergency fund to avoid tapping into my HSA. And anytime I tap into my emergency fund, I've got to be honest, it gives me a little bit of stress and a little bit of anxiety, and that's okay. For me, this was a recent example of that, and I think it's a way to talk about this on the show. But just now, I want to mention this because I think this is hilarious. I'm going to make fun of every nuclear medicine physician that's listening to the show right now, and so if that's you, email me. I'll apologize. But it was absolutely hilarious, right? So I'm at a teaching hospital. I work at Wake Forest, North Carolina, for those of you that don't know. I'm sitting in this room, and I'm one of those people, like I always let trainees practice on me, right? So I've got no problem. My psychiatrist is a resident. My endocrinologist is soon to be a fellow. And so the attending comes in the room, nuclear medicine attending, and he's like, "Hey, do you mind if I bring some trainees into the room?" And I said, "No, of course not. Like, the more the merrier." And so he brings them in. He's like, "Yeah, they have to watch this procedure." And I work in the world of anesthesia around surgical procedures that take hours and hours and hours. And I do procedures myself, and I consider them short. And they might take somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, right? Depending on what it is. Sometimes it takes 15 or 5. It just kind of depends. But they're always procedures. And they're things you watch and use your hands and all that stuff. So I ended up having like 6 people in this room watching me swallow a pill. And I was like, it is fascinating to me that whoever the regulatory people are, probably nuclear related because this is radioactive iodine, but they had to come in and observe me swallowing a pill. I found that really interesting that they had to have that as part of their training.
That is hilarious.
Yeah. So if you were in nuclear medicine, I apologize if I just offended you. But that it just didn't seem like a real procedure to me. I know that's a box you got to check in order to be able to give people their nuclear medicine, but we're going to talk about financial stress, anxiety on the show. So if you're someone on the show, before we jump in, that is looking for financial literacy talks for your trainees, residents, fellowship programs, send me an email, jimmy@moneymeetsmedicine.com. I've been doing more and more of this lately and really have enjoyed just getting into financial literacy, teaching, education in a more active role. So if that's something that you're interested in, you're a program director listening to the show. I've had other program directors reach out. I've mentioned a few of the places that I've been recently in prior episodes. jimmy@moneymeetsmedicine.com. You can also point your trainees to the book. That's at moneymeetsmedicine.com. It's free to download. So check that out and let me know what you think. Happy to chat offline more about that. So Justin, I know that I've got like my anecdotal personal experience of like financial stress from recent medical expenses, but you have lots of experience from the financial advisor side of seeing people go through financial stress from things that may come up. So what are some common examples that really kind of press this button for people?
Yeah, I think there's 2 circumstances in which I see people really two, I would say, like commonly occurring circumstances in which people really are under the gun with a lot hitting them at once. One is when you transition to practice, where you've got a bunch of student loans, you've been bouncing along on the PGY scale for a while, you've got to move across the country, do first, last, and security, and all these other things. And you didn't get a signing bonus, you're waiting for your first attending paycheck to hit, and that's a time of significant financial strain. Another is if you're trying to launch a practice. So I do a lot of work with pain doctors. Pain management is one of those few specialties in which you can still practice independently. And whenever you're firing up a new business or investing meaningfully in an existing medical practice or surgery center or other related business, that's a time at which, especially if you're earlier in practice, it can create a lot of strain. Sometimes it's just the indebtedness, the psychological effect of the additional loan. Sometimes it's the actual cash outflow. In either of those two circumstances, people are rightly concerned about their financial wherewithal and their ability to, continue to absorb. What is that? Like, if that next thing, that next domino, if that hits me at the wrong time, what then am I going to do? So I think this is a really helpful conversation for, especially people who have just finished training and are in the throes of like waiting for that first paycheck to hit. This is something that I see a lot.
Yeah. And I think that a great place to start with this, because it's a common experience for people. I mentioned kind of the one-off experience that I've recently had that caused some financial stress or anxiety in my own life. And that's a great example that you're giving too, that's probably more pervasive and common for people to experience. And I remember experiencing that myself, even in medical school when I was transitioning to become an intern. I don't know. I didn't know anything about money. It just didn't budget, didn't know anything about the stuff. Didn't dawn on me that the money that I was spending each month wouldn't actually get my first paycheck until the end of July for the work that I had done. And so I had this like 6-week gap, ended up having to, fortunately I'm privileged enough to have been able to borrow money from my grandmother who hilariously made me pay it back and like signed contract and everything. So yeah, it was like legit. And
she was my client. I would have told her to do the same thing. So
that's hilarious because I have thoughts about it on the other side that may disagree with you, but I'm a big fan. We'll segue on this. That's fine. I'm a big fan personally. If you're going to give money to family or friends, I think there are two ways to do it. You can either be strict, like here are the black and white lines, contractual agreement, have a signature, which is the route that my grandmother chose. Personally, for me, I would just rather give things away, no strings attached. So like, here's your money. It's a gift. Happy to help you. I do not expect it back, and I do not expect anything in return. And I'm just releasing you from owing me anything because at the end of the day, the relationship is more important than money. And so for me, that's the tack that I typically go. I mean, if it was some like $100,000 sum, I mean, maybe I might feel differently. I don't know. Do you ever counsel people that direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously circumstantially dependent. If somebody was independently wealthy, if they're asking me, hey, I'm thinking about a loan to my grandchild, how should I do it? Like, well, definitely with a promissory note that is clearly articulating the terms and like it's very buttoned up. But if it's like, oh, I want to help out little Jimmy, like, how should I do it? Like, well, give him the money. You got $9 million and, you're not going to live that much longer. I think that we would explore that together.
Yeah. So that was an example of financial stress in my life, was bridging that gap.
Yeah.
And I've definitely experienced that on other occasions as well. And it's interesting because sometimes this is even planned. I recently bought back The Physician Philosopher, which was the business I started in 2017. And sending 5-figure checks to people, even though I knew it was coming and I'd been saving for it. And just sending the check, at least until the last check was kind of freeing. It's like, I'm done. Freedom, right? The first couple, I was like, man, this is pretty painful. And that money could be going somewhere else, if I'm being honest. And so there was a little bit of stress and anxiety around that too. But I think that regardless of the situation, one of the best ways to combat this from like a practical standpoint is educating yourself. I really do think that quote at the beginning, worrying is like paying a debt you don't owe. Like we worry about a lot of things that aren't really necessary. And part of the reason that we don't know they're not necessary is because we don't educate ourselves on it. I talked in the last episode about knowledge kind of being the antidote of fear. I do think educating yourself in the personal finance realm is one of the ways that you can kind of combat this. And the reason why is because you start to do certain things once you educate yourself in personal finance. You might create a spending plan, which is what I refer to, what my wife and I do. You might create a budget, and that helps provide some parameters, some constraints, which mean you might be saving for things that are coming up, including a rainy day fund, an emergency fund, whatever you might call it. And so for us, having those multiple like opportunities that we can tap into that, God forbid something happens, is one thing that's really helped me with financial stress and anxiety. And so we talked about this on the show before, of just having multiple ways to pull the lever so that you have access to cash should you need it. And so in our life, for example, that my first $10,000 is sitting in a regular checking account that I can tap into just completely immediately and fully, and there's no delay. And then the remainder of my emergency fund is sitting in a money market fund so that it can at least keep up with inflation. And that money that's the one when I have to tap into that one, that's when I'm like, I'm having some anxiety, I'm having some stress. But I know it's there. And so until I tap into that, I don't really have a lot of stress about it. But having the financial knowledge, okay, you need to have pots of money you can tap into when things happen. That does provide some relief from this.
Yeah. One of my favorite exercises when I talk to somebody I see this in like, particularly I'm going to do a business thing. How should I plan for it cohort is to do you describe like the God forbid something should happen. We should call this like the God forbid something should happen cash access hierarchy. And where we say, okay, you have to come up with $1 million of cash tomorrow or in short order. Like, how are we going to beg, borrow, and steal? Obviously, we're not going to steal in order to come up with this. And you talk about like I think Tim Ferriss calls this idea of fear setting. That's where I'm sort of familiar with this, where you sit down and think about what's the worst case and how are you going to deal with it. And if you can come up with a plan and it seems reasonable, then you shouldn't worry about that. It's kind of his line of thinking, which I think is useful. This is sort of the financial equivalent of that, where, okay, if I had to come up with this amount of money, how much is in your checking? How much is in your savings? Those are sort of the easy, low-hanging fruit. How much credit card capacity do I have? How much credit card capacity could I get? How much is in my 401k? There's the $50,000 loan you can take if your balance is 100K or more, but then there's how much is in my retirement accounts, your Roth IRAs, how much could I reasonably expect to access from any family members who might loan me money? And you create the list from least painful to access to most painful to access. How much is my car worth?
Don't touch the car. Don't touch the car.
Yeah, that's right. That's at the very bottom of your list, obviously. But what you may find in some cases is that there's like significantly more. And you mentioned, Jimmy, like a $6,000 medical surprise causing you some angst. If you knew that the total amount of access to capital was like 185 grand or 300 grand or what, like line of credit on your house, there's these pots of money or potential money that once you stack them all up and look at them, think like, what are the circumstances that would lead me to need that bottom total amount of cash? And what I find is that when we go through this, at least for clients who have a balance sheet that looks healthy, and again, when you're early in your wealth building journey, there's a lot less here. But when you've got some equity in your house and you've got the retirement accounts and things, like in order for you to really redline to like hit that catastrophic, this is a big actual problem in the real world point, it's very rare. And it's clarifying for everyone, all of the, like me and them, the client, to say like, okay, here's the actual number. How do we feel about that number? What are the circumstances that would land us there? And 9 times out of 10, we're like, oh yeah, you're right. We're actually doing fine. Thank you very much.
And this is an example of something that we've talked about several times on the show recently, where when you define something and you make it objective, it provides clarity and it gets rid of guilt and stress and fear. All right. So we talked about in the last episode, when you realize that you've actually saved enough money to retire by the age that you want, you should spend the rest guilt-free. There's no scarcity or fear that comes out of that because you're doing enough to get to your goals. And this works the same way. I actually love that idea. So with coaching clients, I call it the worst case scenario. That's the way that I think through things. And probably the most applicable place that I see this working is when people are considering changing jobs. So first, defining the problem. Why are you changing jobs, right? Because people are like, oh, it's terrible. It's toxic. Hate this place. Burnout. Okay, let's talk about that. Like, what's actually going on? You're like, my boss yelled at me. Okay, let's have a conversation about that. Let's figure it out. What were the words that were said? Like, really diving in and defining that. But let's say you get to the point where you're like, I want to leave my job, potentially. Now we're comparing job A and job B. And so what's the worst case scenario if you accept either one of those jobs, right? You walk it through, you label it out. And oftentimes what will happen is people will say, like, the worst case scenario, if I take that job, like, I couldn't deal with that. Like, okay, well, it sounds like you're staying. What's the worst case scenario if you stay? You're like, I couldn't deal with that. Okay, well, it sounds like you're going. And if you get to this beautiful place of being able to tolerate both worst case scenarios, then you just get to decide, right? So that's kind of what you're describing is like, once you've defined what the worst case scenario is and been really clear about that and objective about it, I got $185,000 I can tap into. What's a $6,000 expense? Like, oh yeah, I guess that does really kind of relieve some of my anxiety, my fear about these things that come up. It decreases that financial stress. And so I think that is a good way of thinking. And some other ways that you might think about this, right? We're talking in, the lines of credit or the stock that you might have available to you. But this is another reason why insurance exists too. The entire point of insurance is to transfer the risk that you're taking to someone else. You're paying them to take that risk. So this is one reason why you get term life insurance, right? Loss of income. You want to make sure your family's taken care of. You don't want to worry about that angst, that stress, that, pressure that comes from worrying about that. So you buy life insurance so that until you're financially independent, your family's taken care of, even if you die. This is the reason you get disability insurance when your human capital of earning income is your most important asset when you're young. And you protect that so that, God forbid, right? The God forbid scenario, a worst case scenario, you get injured or disabled, your lifestyle doesn't have to change because you are able to replace your income. That's why I argue that, since on prior shows you just mentioned like human capital being the most important thing when you're young, if that's your number one asset, and we talk about all things in investing and paying down debt on the show, if you don't have an income, none of that matters. Right? That's why I always say disability insurance is your number one financial task as a physician. The purpose of that is to help kind of deal with that reality, but also to reduce your stress and your anxiety, because hopefully you never need to use it. But there are ways to deal with this by setting up processes that you have available to you, whether that's an insurance side or whether that's the emergency fund and the line of credit side, that help decrease this angst.
I do think that what I have observed in this discussion with clients, and I have another one who, like in her mid 60s, she was divorced later in life. Works in anesthesia and makes good money, but basically has zero retirement, like close to zero literal dollars, and even still some indebtedness into her 60s. And her outlook for her financial future is she's going to be pretty resource constrained. And she came to me highly anxious, basically saying like I'm okay with it being bad, but I just need you to tell me like what is the path forward. And I observed that the ambiguity for her was a much bigger problem than the actual resource constraint. And I think in a lot of these cases, when you haven't thought it through, when you don't understand the objective realities, the fear from the unknown is like way more terrible than she was saying, like, just tell me what I need to do, and then I will have this burden lifted. I know, like, well, yeah, I got to work till 74, and that is crappy, but at least I know what I need to do. And then the path is laid out and I can walk the path. If you're not sure what the path looks like, that is often a source of fear that can be rectified just from going through some of this planning work.
I shared with you before we hit record on this one, and I didn't realize it would play into this, but just kind of my journey with entrepreneurial stress and anxiety. And a big reason why was because there were changes that happened in my business that I didn't realize were coming. I didn't foresee. They ended up drastically impacting how the business was doing, to the point where I was essentially operating a business and paying everyone else except for me at one point. And so that created a massive amount of stress. This last thing I thought about before going to sleep, first thing I thought about before when I woke up. And a lot of that came from the fact that I couldn't solve the problem and I didn't know how to get out of it. And it just felt very ethereal and nebulous and ambiguous, as you just described, the ambiguity. Once I figured out what the plan was, it drastically reduced the stress that was being created by that situation. And so when I talk on the show about being objective and clarifying things and defining things and making them concrete so that it is less stressful, I just want to call out that I'm the pot calling the kettle black. That is 100% me swimming in the same water as any of you that are listening to the show. It's a very real reality for a lot of us. And yeah, so I just want to mention that because I resonate for different reasons to the anesthesiologist that you're describing at the end of their career. And it really was a lack of plan and just like this feeling like anything could come and get me at any moment and that things were crashing down. And I just didn't really have a sense for how good or bad it really was.
And I think we're not describing, Jimmy, something that like some people deal with, the anxiety around the unknown. We're talking about something that is common to humanity. Like if you don't know what's coming down the pike, it's a normal reflex to feel anxiety. And you and I are both business owners, and I think you probably are, we share some like internal motivation and some, if you tell me the mountain that I need to climb, then I'm like, okay, I like let's do this. And I think back to like launching my business, APM Wealth, that's now 7 or 8 years old, and we've hit some like fun milestones in the last handful of years. But at the very beginning, there is this like, oh my gosh, there's so many ways this could go wrong. But once you break it down, okay, I need one client a month, and they're going to pay this much in revenue. My costs are this. In order to get one client, I need to have 10 conversations. That turns into 3 introductory calls. That turns into, and then okay, in order to have 10 conversations, I need to reach out to 20 of my friends and have introductory discuss. Then it's like, okay, well, I gotta send out 20 emails a day to people in my network, and they're like, I could do that in order to build a life that I'm like really optimistic about and excited about. And the challenge, like if that doesn't motivate you, then you shouldn't be a business owner. But often what you'll find is that, well, I know the road now, and I am like, I'm stoked. I love getting out of bed and doing that every morning. And it does require the foundational work, but once the path has been articulated, it is surprise. Even if it's like a terrible, I mean, I'll put that in air quotes. Like even if it's a hard road, often that is invigorating for people to at least know what the road is.
The clarity is so important. And for anybody listening to the show and you're in medicine, you're like, I want to go start my own business. Just recognize that the path to become a physician is very linear. Like you get to put your blinders on, you're the horse, like just doing your thing, going down the path. Like there's a very well-defined path. This is what it takes to become a medical student and then a resident and then an attending physician and then to become a partner if you're in private practice or a professor if you're in academics. It is very, very laid out for you. If you step into the world of entrepreneurship, there are no rules. There is no straight path forward. You can go 360 degrees in any direction that you so choose, which may sound incredibly liberating. But for those of us that are very productive and would much prefer to have a plan and just to climb that mountain, as you're describing, Justin, it can be really, really stressful because there is no one solution. Like it's not like there's this problem and you just got to solve for X. And it's like, well, there are 50 problems, and before you solve for X, you got to figure out which problem is the problem. And so, for me, entrepreneurship has been great and wonderful and extremely stressful and terrifying at times.
Yeah.
The entire human emotion, the spectrum of the gamut I've experienced in owning my own business. That said, I will also point out, not to turn this into a show about entrepreneurship, but a lot of people have this false idea, particularly when you're transitioning careers or businesses, that these people that created these amazing businesses, they just jumped in with both feet, fear abandoned, with reckless abandonment. They just jumped in and committed to this wonderful idea and it just became successful. Most people don't do that. And the benefit of being a physician who does step into entrepreneurship is that you are a physician. You have a very stable, secure income. And so you're able to dabble in things and figure out these problems without losing your very secure income. Whereas a lot of people that work outside of medicine, they may have to jump in with both feet or live in their parents' garage for a year while they try to get this business off the ground, Apple style. So just recognize that it is stressful. It is scary. It is something to behold. But at the same time, you have a bridge that helps you kind of take that leap. That's going to be very scary for you because it's not linear. But just know that that's there and you don't have to just abandon everything, because I think people have that misrepresentation and that prevents them from starting businesses.
And I think too, if you can identify a couple of those key variables that are going to create this successful enterprise for a physician considering entrepreneurship, understanding your own hardwiring, and to the extent that medicine has selected for folks who like the linear path with a concrete outcome, you can, to some extent, I don't want to say artificially construct linearity, and I'll make up a word there, but through the creation of the algorithm that is like going to push on the biggest, in business, we have this idea of the one big thing that's capital O, capital B, capital T. What is the one big thing that if you did it, everything else would be rendered irrelevant? All the little questions, like they would all work themselves out. If you did this thing and accomplished it, what is that thing? And if you have a business that you can create a set of actions that will reliably accomplish whatever that thing is, And to use a concrete example, like if you're launching a financial planning and investment management business, well, if I was able to have a conversation every day with somebody who was really rich and maybe wanted to do business with me, then everything, like all the other problems, staffing, infrastructure, manage, like all the operations, like if you're making money, if there's revenue happening, then all those things are going to work themselves out. So if with whatever the venture is that you're going to consider, how do you create activities around accomplishing that one purpose that will allow all the downstream questions to work themselves out? Often you can be busy. We call this in our industry playing office. I'll put that in air quotes. Like you're doing things, you're like answering emails, and you're like, there's business activity happening, but you're not pursuing the one big thing. And as a result, there's this illusion of progress, of productivity. But unless you're pushing on the actual problem in your business, you're not actually progressing towards anything. You're just wasting your time and losing time. And time is non-renewable, as we have discussed. So understanding the challenges that you face with the desire for linearity and saying, okay, here's the thing I need to do. Here's the things I need to do in order to accomplish that thing. And we'll let all the other stuff work itself out. That can be incredibly useful. I would say like above average utility for physicians who are interested in pursuing this self-employment journey.
100%. And there's a theme here, right? Be concrete, define your goals, be intentional. And once you do that, the answers will sort themselves out. So whether that means having an emergency fund, having a HELOC, right? Having the money market fund, having the 401k and knowing that you can tap into 50 grand of that, knowing that and defining it, and then being intentional about what is the problem and is it really a problem? And if it is, go solve it. And if it's not, stop worrying about it, right? And so that all comes with being intentional. And that is a common theme, not just in the show, not just about money. That's a common theme for marriage and raising kids and entrepreneurship and professionally and every other area of your life. So get clear about your financial goals, know what the options are, know what the worst case scenario is, figure out how you would deal with it. Once you have that information, you might find that stress, that anxiety will be alleviated. So as we tie things up, don't forget, you can go to moneymeetsmedicine.com to snag a free copy of the Physician Philosopher's Guide to Personal Finance. We can help you get disability insurance. Or if you're looking for free virtual talks for your residents and fellows, email me at jimmy@moneymeetsmedicine.com. We can talk more about the topics we typically discuss when I give those talks for trainees, which I'm really looking forward to doing more of. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for sharing the show with everybody. Justin and I will see you next week. Cheers. Justin Harvey is a certified financial planner at APM Wealth, where he helps anesthesiologists and pain medicine physicians. Dr. Jimmy Turner is a practicing academic anesthesiologist at Wake Forest in North Carolina. He's also a licensed insurance agent. However, either Justin or Jimmy are your financial planner, investment advisor, or insurance agent. This show is expressly for general education and entertainment purposes only. Nothing should be considered financial advice. All views expressed are solely the views of the guests on the show and do not represent the views or opinions of their employer.